My Lord, I just wish to place myself on a record. It's Advocate S.J. Kutsia from High Court Chambers, Victoria Bar. I am instructed by the State Attorney to represent Warrant Officer Else in this proceedings. Thank you.
To call our next witness, Professor Kenneth Pahad. Your Lordship, we'd like to hand up the curriculum vitae of Professor Pahad. We have marked it as Exhibit C2, so it'll be part of Volume C. All the parties have been given a copy of his CV. Thank you, my Lord. Professor Pahad.
Kenneth David Pahad.
Do you have any objection in taking the oath?
I do not.
Do you swear that the evidence that you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I swear that the evidence that I'm about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Please raise your right hand and say so nothing but.
So help me God.
Thank you, my Lord. Professor Pahad, firstly, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule at Mill Park Hospital to be with us this morning. Professor Pahad, as has been explained to you during our consultation, we have called you to court this morning to advise the court on the do's and don'ts of treatment of individuals who have suffered critical injury, for example, after a 10-story fall. Before we tackle that question, I'd like you to give the court a sense of your expertise and experience as a doctor and as a specialist surgeon. Now, we have provided the court with a copy of your CV, which is just under 50 pages. We don't have time to go through all 50 pages, so can I ask you to provide us with some of the highlights of your professional career And, my Lord, in this regard, I can direct you to page 2 of his curriculum vitae, which provides for a helpful overview. And perhaps, Professor, you can commence with telling us what you're currently doing, and then speak about your qualifications and certain of your experiences.
Thank you. I am a qualified surgeon, and I've received significant extra training in the field of trauma surgery. That is the field of surgery dealing with the injured patient, my Lord. I am currently Professor Emeritus at the University of Witwatersrand, and was for a period of 15 years Professor and Head of the Department of Surgery at WITS at Charlotte General Hospital. Prior to that, for a further 15 years, I was Chief of Trauma at the same hospital. Since 1914, I have been Chief of Trauma at Mill Park Academic Hospital, and that is a satellite of the university and is recognized as a training center as well. So for my adult life, I have been, after my training, trained as a general surgeon and as a trauma surgeon. I qualified at WITS in 1974. Did my specialist surgical training overseas at Guy's Hospital in London and at the Birmingham Accident Hospital, and returned here in 1984.
Thank you, Professor. You're also currently the Secretary General of the International Society of Surgery, which I understand is the world's oldest and largest international surgical organization. And just for the record, you have some 80 publications to your name, as well as 20 book chapters, and you've written 3 books on trauma surgery. I'd like to highlight, with the leave of the court, some of the book titles and journal pieces which I think really highlights your expertise in this area. And if there are any others that you think should be highlighted, please let me know. So amongst the credited journals that you have authored is one by the name of Regional Emergency Care in 1989, Flight for Life, Making It Work, Selection of Patients for Air Transport, published in 1990, Roadside Endotracheal Intubation. Incidentally, for us lay people, what is that about?
If a patient at the side of the road has breathing difficulties, previously the options of what to do were limited, but with the improvement in training of what became paramedics, it was possible to put a plastic tube down into the trachea and get good breathing for that patient.
Thank you. You've also got a few published articles on gunshot injuries. One is titled Major Gunshot Injury in South Africa. An interesting piece on penetrating neck injuries. The treatment of bleeding is to stop bleeding. Treatment of trauma-related hemorrhage. And then you have published a book titled Definitive Surgical Trauma Care, which is now in its 4th edition. Professor, any other journals or books that you wish to highlight for the court?
I'm happy with that.
Professor, I may say that from your CV you've had a distinguished career and certainly not an idle one. Professor, in preparing for your testimony today, did you study any documents or reports?
I did. I was furnished with the post-mortem report from Dr. Skeppers, who was the medical officer who performed the post-mortem. I also received a short text from Dr. Vernon Kemp certifying that he had certified death, and those were the two relevant ones that I have received.
Your Lordship, for the record, the statements of Daisel, Patel and Kemp, as well as the post-mortem report, can be found in Volume B. Professor, perhaps it would be helpful if we just summarize the contents of the statements of Warrant Officer Daisel and Brigadier Patel, because this essentially sums up the police version of what happened in the aftermath of the fall. Warrant Officer Daisel alleges that once he was advised of the fall, he raced down to the site together with a Colonel Hreiling. He grabbed 2 blankets on the way, and on arrival at the scene, he attempted, or in fact did, roll Timol onto the blanket and transported him, or first discovered that there was a pulse, that he was alive, transported him into the entrance foyer of John Vorster Square, apparently examined him again. At that point in time, discovered that there was no pulse, and then removed him to the 9th floor, at which point in time Dr. Kemp arrived on the scene some minutes later and declared Timol to be dead. Brigadier Patel was not present at this time, but he did bump into Colonel Hreiling and Warrant Officer Daisel in the ground floor entrance foyer to John Vorster Square. His evidence is slightly different because he saw them carrying Mr. Timol towards the elevators. So that, in sum, is the police version. I would like you to offer your comment on what the police did when they discovered Mr. Timol lying in the garden outside the south wing of John Vorster Square. And when you offer your comment, please do so wearing your hat as a specialist surgeon and medical expert. And please inform this court whether they acted appropriately, and if not, what in your view they ought to have done.
Thank you. My Lord, if I may just make a couple of additional remarks about my background. I trained in medicine at Wits from 1966 to 1973. One of the things that I did during that time was worked on what was then the Sandton Ambulance Service and Johannesburg Ambulance Service, such as it was. Both ambulance services at that time were completely segregated into a European and a non-European service, and I worked on both. When I returned from the United Kingdom in 1984, the ambulance service was, to my memory, unified, but I also took over as academic head of ambulance training for the province of the Transvaal. The difference between the 1960s and 70s is that ambulance personnel were essentially ambulance drivers, and I'll come back to that. By 1984, the Transvaal Ambulance Training College had been established. The concept of paramedic had not yet been developed, so there was a degree of ambulance training even in 1984, and that's 13 years later, which recognized that ambulance personnel were not people wearing a white coat with very limited training. And the paramedic training became available in the late 1980s, much later. So at the time of this incident taking place, ambulance services had very poorly equipped ambulances. Ambulance personnel had at best an advanced first aid certificate. There was really very limited training beyond that. And my understanding of police officers is that they had first aid, but at a much more basic level. And maybe as a generalization, the most basic levels of first aid are taught or were taught throughout the gold mining industry to all underground miners. The ambulance personnel had a more advanced level and the police were somewhere in between. And so the ambulances at that time were almost not equipped apart with stretchers and blankets, certainly not with drips. And the expertise of the ambulance personnel or the police in terms of what we think of today was not even dreamt of. It was very limited indeed. So that is the sort of background as to what pertained at the time and what I then, as a very junior ambulance officer, had at my disposal during the time that I was at medical school but working part-time in an ambulance service. So as a preface, those are the conditions. The first aid at the time, and it really was developed over years from the British particularly, the first aid at the time recognized that people could be severely injured and specifically recognized the danger of neck injury, so that if somebody had fallen or been hit by a car, there was a very high risk of neck injury. And the recommendation from both the military and civil emergency care books at the time was that a patient, if they had been badly injured, should not be moved. They should be turned into what was called the coma position, which essentially meant lying on the side, almost using the hard surface of the road or whatever it was as a stabilizing surface. One knee was drawn up, so they were, in this particular situation, there was one leg was broken. Patient would have or should have been rolled to the other side, one leg drawn up, the knee bent, and the patient left lying in what was called the three-quarter position, lying on their side until emergency help arrived, and that included an ambulance stretcher. They were put onto that and transported to hospital.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, one of the reasons why we believe this evidence is very important is because over the years the family have had great concern that the manner in which Timol was handled, physically handled at that time, could very well have worsened his particular condition. The police in question were aware that Mr. Timol had fallen 10 stories and presumably would have known that anybody falling 10 stories would be critically hurt. In your view, would moving a person, any person in that position, render considerable or any harm, further harm to the injured person?
Lord, any sort of movement of a critically injured patient, even at that time, was recognized as causing more severe injuries. Clearly, no one had the details on the post-mortem at that time. Equally, I have no knowledge of the surface onto which the deceased fell. But at that time, the police, in fact, certainly the provincial police and mostly the South African Police Service, didn't even carry first aid kits in their vehicles. And one of the things that we had both as students and doctors was we were told repeatedly, even if the patient is in the middle lane of the newly opened M1 motorway, they must stay there. They must not be moved because far more damage will occur. And we had situations where roadside tow trucks helped us to tow the vehicle out of the middle lane of the highway before the person was removed from the vehicle, or if they were lying on the highway, assisted us to move them out of the source of danger. So across the emergency services, including traffic police, and I assume the South African police as it was drummed in, you do not move these patients because you may cause further injury, particularly to the spine. Particularly also if there are broken bones, big broken bones, and the deceased did have what would have been very visible, I think, a big damage to his one leg with a break in his leg. The teaching was you had to split that before moving it. So I would recommend that this patient should not have been moved until emergency services arrived, but I have no knowledge of the availability of emergency services at that time.
You say that it would exacerbate the injury, but would you say that it would be fatal to move a person who's injured? Can it result in death?
My Lord, the normal cause of death in patients such as this is either they obstruct their airway, they're actually unable to breathe, typically seen in somebody with very bad facial injuries or bad neck injuries, or they're actually unable to breathe because the lungs are not working, or they bleed until they die, or they have such a severe brain injury that after a while the brain stops working. And any factor which can make this worse, this is why the three-quarter position has been advocated. It allowed the airway to be open. It allowed the maximum choice of being able to breathe. And more importantly, the not moving of the patient meant that whatever breaks there were would not cause further damage to the tissues around them by moving those breaks and increasing the amount of bleeding that the patient had. So the restriction in movement would have been planned as reducing the factors that would increase the onset of death. So they would not of themselves have been the only cause of death, but they could have made the other causes worse.
It could be a contributing factor.
Correct.
Was there any mention of that in the reports that you studied from Dr. Skeppers or Dr. Kemp? Did you find any discussion on this subject?
Dr. Kemp purely certified that the patient was dead, so there was nothing to add there. Dr. Skeppers had a very comprehensive, in my opinion, post-mortem for the time, and he documented neck injuries, he documented other spinal injuries, he documented internal injuries, all of which could have bled quite a lot, and I have no doubt contributed both to the onset of death. But on top of that, he documented two major bony injuries of the arm, the upper arm, the humerus, and of the femur. And moving a patient in a blanket rather than on a stretcher would have moved those fractures, and I think would have increased the amount of bleeding from the fractures and contributed to the death.
And did you have sight of Dr. Glackman's report?
I have not.
You only looked at the Dr. Skeppers report?
I have.
And from that report and the injuries he explained there, would you then conclude that it's possible, it's a possibility that the nature of the injuries were such that if the body would be removed or moved from the position it was, that might contribute towards the death of the patient? Would you say that? based on your knowledge?
My Lord, based on the post-mortem findings and the severity of brain injury sustained by the impact, I think that the eventual outcome would have been fatal come what may. But that was not known at the time.
Yes.
So my opinion is that the movement would have contributed to a more rapid cause of death.
Okay. You may proceed.
Your Lordship, I should advise you that unfortunately the Dr. Gluckman report was part of the earlier part of the record, which is still missing, and we're still searching for that part of the record.
I tried to look at the documents that were before me. I couldn't find it, and it puts us at a rather difficult position, but you may proceed.
And just also for your Lordship's knowledge, we do have the testimony of Dr. Gluckman as part of the transcript, but I can tell you that he doesn't deal with this aspect. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Professor, while we're dealing with what ought to have happened or not happened at the impact site, can I put to you from a layperson's perspective what I think should have happened, and you can either agree and perhaps elaborate, where there's a potential spinal injury, one should immediately stop the head or neck from moving to prevent further damage. Would you agree with that assertion?
Particularly when you're falling from a height, unless you have any other evidence, when you fall from a height, particularly if you fall on your feet, that may not have been the case here, but again, that was not known at the time. The whole force of landing works axially. The force is applied, for example, to the feet, and the shock of landing goes through the spine from the bottom to the top. And then when you fall over, often you then hit your head hard on the road. So not only is there a very high risk of injury to the neck, because the head moves independently of the torso and the neck itself can be damaged, as in fact turned out in this case. But in addition to that, the axial compression, think of a whole lot of teacups stacked up. That's the spinal cord. And if you drop those teacups as a column onto a hard surface, some of the teacups in the middle may break as well. And that, in fact, is also recorded in the post-mortem. We assume this in any fall from a height. So even in the first aid books, not only is the neck protected, but the recommendation is the patient should not be picked up by the arms and by the legs, because the bits in between will bend, but the patient should be what is called body rolled. And that was known and practiced at that time, and we practiced it as ambulance personnel, and it was taught in the first aid book. So you didn't pick up and drag a person off. That's a little different in a military context, because obviously there is combat risk. But in a civilian context, they were picked up or rolled onto a board or onto a stretcher without moving the spine further. Not just the neck, but the whole spine.
And further, Professor, would it be advisable to grip each side of the head to support the head in a position so that the head, neck and spine are in a straight line?
That would be correct.
And then one would want to support the head until emergency services can take over, no matter how long it takes for those emergency services to arrive?
That is correct.
And then finally, one may want to open the airway in case the person is unresponsive. So it is, as a matter of record on the police version, that none of these things happened. Professor, you made reference in your evidence to injuries that Mr. Timol sustained. to his neck and to his spine, in fact. And we also know from the post-mortem report that he also sustained severe head injuries. If you can recollect, can you describe those injuries and perhaps indicate to the court why in such injuries it would have been best not to have moved this particular man?
May I refer to the post-mortem report?
Yes. Let's have the PM.
My Lord, I'm referring to the post-mortem report by Dr. N.J. Skeepers, who is the senior government pathologist. I'm not sure of your bundle reference number.
My Lord, it's in volume B, I believe it's exhibit X. Is it XX? Okay, so volume B, exhibit X. In fact, it's described as that. Yes, it's X, pages 48 to 59.
Volume B.
Yes.
I've just looked at X and get something different there. I get Mohammed Khan.
It's a volume, Your Lordship, which has all the affidavits and exhibits of the original inquest.
I'm on that one here. I'll just have to go to the index here.
Can I take a copy, please?
XX1.
Stop it and take it out. Stop it. Lord, we can give you a
Yes,
copy if you
I have.
you have it. Okay.
It's XX1. It's not X. Yes.
Thanks, Professor. You may proceed.
My Lord, I'm not, for obvious reasons, going to go through this in detail, but I will pick up on a couple of the salient points, and with Your Lordship's permission, I'll report in English. I welcome if anyone feels that I'm not translating adequately. On page 50, uitwendige voorkoms van die lichaam, it reports on the external injuries, and the first line is that there is a fracture of the right elbow and a fracture of the mid-shaft of the right femur. These are the two external fractures. And certainly the elbow and the femur fracture, that is the upper leg, would have been quite visible, I think, in terms of distortion of the shape of the arm or the leg, especially the leg. Moving to page 51, under item 6, the schedule or the skull, the report from the third line reports there is a fracture of the base of the skull and a fracture of the posteriorly and the left orbital plateau and the ethmoids. In other words, the skull has a top, a sides, and a bottom, and that surrounds the brain. So this is the area under the brain, between the brain and the body itself. It's the thickest part of the skull, and to break it requires a very large amount of force. That's not totally relevant to the skull. It's what's in the skull that's important. In other words, if you see a fracture of the base of the skull, that implies that the brain has the potential for very great injury. And also under, I'm sorry, I misread, skedal is number 5. And then number 6, skedal inhoud, it reports widespread subarachnoid bleeding, especially on the inferior aspect of the left frontal and temporal areas. So again, the brain occupies the skull. We have this bad break under the brain, and bleeding within the brain and on the surface of the brain, primarily where that break was. Now that's the most protected part of the brain, and is also the area to some extent which governs your really important functions. That's the bit of the brain which tells you to breathe. That's the part of the brain which also maintains your blood pressure and pulse, and it's called the midbrain. And that was the area that was the most badly damaged. Moving on to number 7, there was a break of the nasal bones and underneath the eyes. That is also part of the way you breathe in air, so it can partly obstruct the way you are breathing your air. And under 8, there are further fractures of the upper jaw, which again can imply this patient may have breathing, particularly if there is bleeding inside the mouth or nose, and the person is lying on their back at any time. That blood accumulates at the back of the mouth and stops the breathing. So traditionally, we again roll the patient, if we can, onto the side so that the blood runs out of the mouth rather than into the lungs or blocks up the breathing. And even in those times, there were 2 techniques taught, which was a mouth sweep to remove any broken teeth and so on from the mouth, and sometimes something called the jaw thrust. When you are holding the head, if you put your thumbs at the back of the jaw and push it forward, it allows breathing to be easier. So that was also why advocate reported that one should hold the neck. The neck structures were reported as bleeding at the front of the neck, and that's important again from the point of view of breathing. Moving down, there are lots of other bruising in the lung cavity, and I'm now on page 52. There was about 230 mils of free blood on the left side of the lung. That's not enough to kill him. Also a tear in the right lung and so on. Those would eventually continue bleeding, but I don't think that they were a specific cause of death here. When we move to the abdominal cavity, just moving forward, please forgive me for a second. The abdominal cavity reported, and I may have to just go forward, that the renal artery had been torn off. In 56. It makes just a comment that there is bleeding around the kidneys. That is halfway down under Nira. on page 56. And I believe it was... cannot locate it at the moment, but somewhere there was a mention of the renal artery on the right being torn. And blood around it.
The last page, he mentions the artery there on the last page, just before, above his signature. Could it be the one that you're looking for?
The left carotid artery shows an area of tearing in the elastic of the elastic vessels. That's not what I was referring to. That's still up in the neck. So there was, I think, significant neck injury, as has been documented. But
Professor, can I refer you to something in particular? This is, it's one of the annexes to the Postmortem report titled Lees Waarnemings. So it's I think it's the very last annex to the PM report. I beg your pardon, the second last annex. And could you comment on paragraph 27? That would be on page 55. And perhaps I'll translate.
okay.
It's titled Spine, and then paragraph 27 says, spinal column, there is a fracture of the body of the 7th cervical vertebrae. And in 28 spinal cord, it simply says not exposed. Could you comment for the court on those two paragraphs?
There is a fracture of the 7th cervical vertebrae. Now, the head is attached to the torso by the so-called cervical vertebrae, which start underneath the skull and finish with the thoracic vertebra. There are 7. So the 7th vertebra is the bottommost one. It's also the most vulnerable because when there is an injury, the head, if it moves, most of the load of that is actually placed on the 7th vertebra. And the 6th and the 7th vertebra are typically the vertebra that break either in a fall or in a bad rugby tackle and render the rest of the body without a spinal cord, so quadriplegic, tetraplegic. So the 7th vertebra, if it has a fracture, that is a major fracture with potential major complications going with it. And that could include permanent spinal injury.
Professor, I think you've demonstrated to us that Mr. Timol had sustained very serious injuries to his spine, his neck, as well as his skull, as well as other injuries. So unless there's anything else in the postmortem report you want to point us to, are you of the considered view that given the peculiar injuries that Mr. Timol suffered, that he should not have been moved from the spot he landed in, and the measures that you have described, emergency measures, should have been taken at that time? Unless
there were circumstances placing his life at further risk, for example, in the middle lane of an uncontrolled motorway, my opinion is that he should not have been moved until he was transported to hospital.
Thank you. And then finally, the example that you gave of police not wanting to move seriously injured persons even on a busy highway, it suggests that there was perhaps a fear or a culture amongst the police at the time that even in a dire situation as a busy highway, there was some reluctance to move injured persons. So in your view, if that culture persisted and you were aware of that culture at the time, were you surprised then to hear that fairly experienced police officers decided to move Mr. Timol almost immediately, notwithstanding their knowledge that this man had fallen 10 stories?
During the time that I worked within the ambulance service, a very senior police officer expressed to me the anxiety in the uniformed South African police that if police officers attempted to administer medical care, including first aid, to anybody, they might be held liable for doing so. In those days, there were no first aid kits on police vehicles, to my knowledge. And the police, for the same reason, expressed a wish not to move patients from the site of their injury, again, because they might be held liable for further injuries that occurred. So I'm very surprised that they would have moved this patient, especially in urban metropolitan Johannesburg, Commissioner Street area, because there was availability of ambulance services at that time, and they were based in central Johannesburg. So the ambulances should have been available reasonably quickly.
And in fact, the impact site was located in a garden just outside the southern wing, which fronted onto a road where an ambulance could easily have stopped in order to attend to the injured Timol and take him to hospital. Does that add to your surprise?
It does.
Anything else? No further questions, Your Lordship.
Thank you, my Lord. Professor Buffett, I'm just on a different tack here. If you were to certify the person dead, how would you go about to discern that the person is dead? What would you do? What would be of significance in a situation like that?
Thank you. And my question, I presume, refers to were a medical practitioner have to certify death?
Yes, a district surgeon. Say, for instance, you were the district surgeon and you were to certify the person dead. What would you do, and what would be of significance then?
There are a number of tests for life and separate tests for brain death, which is more relevant to transplantation. But the circumstances you are referring to here, I would look for external signs of life, in other words, any movement, any attempt to breathe at all. Then I would look at measuring the basic parameters of life, and that is, again, are there any attempts to breathe? Is there a pulse present? Because if there's a pulse present, then the heart is still beating and the person is still alive. And also any reflexes. Reflexes are a response to basic functions, not higher brain functions. So that if you're in a doctor's consulting room and the doctor taps your knee and the knee moves, you're not moving the knee, it's a basic spinal function. Equally, if you shine a light into the eye, the pupil gets smaller. So a patient who was making no attempt to breathe at all, and I'm taking 1971, there are other tests now, no attempt to breathe at all, no pulses palpable at all, and shining light in the eye, the pupil is widely dilated and not responding, that would have been what was used to ascertain the cause of death.
The reason I'm asking you, if we look at the original inquest Exhibit T, my Lord, that would be Volume B, Exhibit T, and that would be page 44, is an affidavit by Dr. Kemp, and I want to read it to you because I want to ask you to comment on some of the matters. Winner Dennis Kemp verklaar, ek is die distriksgeneesheer te Johannesburg. Op 27/10/1971 omstreeks 3:55 het ek 'n berig ontvang as gevolg waarvan ek na John Vosserplein gegaan het. Met my aankoms daar om 4:05 namiddag het ek na die veiligheidskantoor op die 9de vloer gegaan, waar die liggaam van 'n Indeerman aan my uitgewys was. Met die ondersoek het ek vasgestel dat hy reeds dood was. And then the interesting part to me, and that's why I'm questioning you on this, hy was pas dood. How would you ascertain that the person died just before that? How would you ascertain that?
I'm having trouble answering in that we are talking about a timeline where a person's heart stops, and that's usually the first event, partly because the brain is no longer telling it to keep going. Until the heart stops, there is some oxygen going to the brain, and after that the pupils will dilate up. But at that time, all the physical appearances, the patient is still warm, the patient's limbs are still, can be physically moved, they're not stiff. And that really doesn't change for a while. And you would have to refer to a forensic scientist to give you more of a time. But certainly within an hour, I would not be able to say whether the patient had died a minute ago or an hour ago.
I'm just thinking, what would be the significance as to exactly when this person died? Why would you put in a death certificate, hy is pas dood? What's the significance of that?
I don't know.
Thank you, my lord. No further questions.
My lord, there's just a couple of issues I would like to ask. Professor, should any attempts have been made to resuscitate Mr. Timol? What would that be? I mean by resuscitation, by massaging his heart or artificial breathing, anything like that. What would that effect have been?
Again, I'm taking the context of 1971, and actually, even in 2017, the attempts at resuscitation by lay people would have been CPR. At that stage, that was not as common as one would want. And I think at the time, the resuscitation would have been to keep the airway open, move them to the coma position, stop any visible bleeding by pressing on it. And that was about it.
And as to the injuries and taking into account the limited paramedical training at that stage in the ambulance services, do I understand you correctly that your evidence is that regardless as to their arrival at the scene, whether it was left there in the garden, Mr. Timol would have died?
From the injuries I've seen, he sustained fatal injuries which may well have been fatal in 2017. But again, that's in retrospect. Those injuries would not have been apparent. And remember, this is even before the days of brain scans, so those injuries would not have been apparent to anyone on the scene at the time.
But objectively, if you look objectively at the injuries and the consequences of those injuries, could anything have been done to prevent him dying?
I do not believe so.
Thank you, my lord.
No questions.
No questions.
My lord, I just have one further technical question, if I may put it to the witness. My lord, my learned colleague, Mr. Pretorius, raised the question of pulse and checking for life. Professor, is it possible in some circumstances not to find a pulse on the wrist or arm, but potentially to find a pulse elsewhere?
You are correct. The first pulse to go is the wrist. As the blood pressure falls, at that stage you can still feel a pulse in the groin, and then that pressure goes, and then the last, because it's relatively easy to feel, is in the neck, just above the collarbone, and I'm indicating on myself, and that's the last one to go, and that would be the pulse we would normally look for, particularly in a slimmer individual, normally look for, because that one is still feelable when the others are not. In 2017, we have electronic means of assessing it.
So, when Officer Daisel alleged in his statement that when Timol had been brought into the foyer and he checked for a pulse on his wrist and there wasn't one and he was therefore dead, possibly or conceivably Daisel could have been wrong?
If I look at the injuries, this patient did not primarily die of loss of blood. If I may put numbers on it very briefly, a normal blood pressure is about 120 millimeters of mercury. That is what most of us in this room have. As you bleed, and the cause of a low blood pressure is generally bleeding, as you bleed, when the blood pressure falls to about 80, it's no longer possible to feel the wrist pulse. When it falls to about 60, it's no longer possible to feel the groin pulse. And when it falls to 40, it's usually not possible to feel any pulse. So the post-mortem findings I see here report primarily brain and vertebral injury with multiple fractures. And those to me were the cause of death whereby the heart stopped beating. That being said, on what I see, I would have expected Warrant Officer Daisel to be correct that he would have been able to feel a pulse if that patient was alive, because there was enough blood to provide the pulse. It's possible he could have been mistaken. Many times it's reported as a pulse when in fact we're feeling our own pulse by mistake.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor, you have studied the post-mortem report. Would you say that those injuries, all of them, were sustained after the fall?
My Lord, thank you. I've studied the post-mortem report, and again, I'm not a forensic scientist. There were a number of injuries which reported, and in fact there are photographs there, as significant bruising, and there are significant visible bruises. They appear to me to be old bruises. I think that the injuries to the spine certainly would have been caused by the fall, but I would not, my expertise would not be to the court's benefit for me to say that they were all sustained by the fall. I think on what I've seen there were some pre-mortem injuries as well, particularly involving the bruising of the skin and of the face and maybe the orbital fractures. But I would not feel as an expert I could comment on that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. You, Professor, you are excused.
Lord, will this be the perfect time for the adjournment?
Oh yeah, no, fine. We can take the tea adjournment and return. We are adjourned until 11:30.
All right. Thank you, Prof. I think that went really well. It was a bit cheeky of the judge to start asking those questions. We really appreciate it. Just one thing, responsible judge. Lord, before we call our next witness, I wonder if I can just deal with some more paperwork.
Yes.
Tomorrow we're also hearing from two medical experts, and we would like to hand up the independent medico-legal opinion of Dr. S.R. Naidu, and also a second document, my Lord, and this is a translation of the post-mortem report into English. It's an unofficial translation, but we have consulted with our colleagues for the state as well as the counsel for the different police officers, and there's no objection to handing up this translation of the post-mortem report.
Did you do the translation?
It was carried out by another doctor.
Yes.
And we can actually put this to Dr. Naidu because he arranged a colleague of his to translate the post-mortem report.
Then that's fine, it will assist. Okay.
My Lord, with your permission, we'd like to mark the independent medico-legal report of Dr. Naidu as C3 and the translation of the post-mortem as C4.
Yes, this is so marked.
Your Lordship, could I bring another matter to your attention?
Yes.
We've consulted with some of our remaining witnesses. Mr. Mudley, who's our trajectory expert, he's indicated that he's only available on Friday morning. We had anticipated not sitting on Friday morning, but with your permission, we would like to call just Mr. Mudley for Friday morning, and we think he could be done before lunch, potentially just after tea. We think we might finish with him.
Okay.
In that case, Your Lordship, we've done some shifting, and we propose moving Mr. Frank Dutton and Mr. Imtiaz Kaji to Thursday afternoon. So we anticipate a full day for Thursday.
Who's coming on Thursday afternoon?
Well, just to remind you, in the morning we have Mr. Don Foster.
Yes.
And then in the afternoon, Mr. Frank Dutton and Mr. Imtiaz Kaji. We'll supply you with an amended witness list.
From Mr. Kaji?
Yes, the nephew of Mr. Timol.
Yes, I know. Is he not coming at the end?
We thought of calling him now because we fear that next week might be quite a busy week.
I've read his affidavit. I would have preferred to hear it at the end. But
if you would prefer to call him towards the end of next week, we're happy with that, Your Lordship.
Yeah, at the end.
Okay.
Next week.
With your leave, I'd like to call our next witness, Your Lordship, and that's Esop Pahad.
Yes. Answer affirmation. Ask the question.
Do you affirm that the evidence that the court should give is actually the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I affirm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. You may be seated, Mr.
Thank you.
Pahad. Yes.
Your Lordship, Mr. Pahad has indicated that he is wearing a hearing aid device, and he has requested us to talk as loudly as we can so that he doesn't have to strain too hard to hear.
Okay.
And I hope my colleagues will also raise their voices should they wish to examine Mr. Pahad. Mr. Pahad, do you have a copy of the affidavit that you attested to on the 18th of July?
I do.
And do you confirm that this is your affidavit?
It is my affidavit.
Your Lordship, for the record, this affidavit is in volume H at page 5. Thank you. Mr. Pahad, thank you for taking the time to come to court this morning. Before we get to your association with Mr. Timol, it's important for us to hear a bit about yourself and for you to describe to the court how it was that you got involved in politics and the liberation struggle. And you may kick off with aspects of your early life and which organizations you started working with.
My parents were very deeply involved in the struggle. My mother has been imprisoned 3 times, twice during the 1946 passive resistance campaign and once in the 1952 defiance campaign. My father was a leader of the Indian Congress, and they worked very closely with Dr. Yusuf Dadu, who is widely regarded as one of our preeminent struggle leaders. So we grew up in a political home. My parents' flat in Johannesburg was used for all types of political meetings, both of the ANC as well as the Indian Congress. So I guess for me to join the demonstrations when I was mere 13 years old in 1952 was a natural progression of what I had grown up with. So my entire life has been devoted to the struggle. And at a young age, at the age of 18, I was elected to the Executive Committee of the Transvaal Indian Youth Congress. And that's where my political activities took place. I was very active in student politics when I was a student at the University of the Witwatersrand. Both my brother Aziz and I were banned in January 1964. We had both graduated in December 63 from WITS. And very interestingly, we were ordered to go to the old special branch Gray's building, which was in Marshallstown. And the special branch officer read the banning orders to us separately. And when I said to him, but this is causing problems because actually banned persons can't communicate with each other. He said, that's not my problem. You go to the chief magistrate and get permission. So we had to walk to the magistrate's court, but he walking behind me because we couldn't communicate. And the chief magistrate said, I'll give you temporary permission to communicate with each other until the Minister of Justice does so. We then had to write to the Minister of Justice, who was Foster at that time, as well as asking him to give us permission to continue with our postgraduate studies at WITS. He wrote back to say that he does not accede to our request to continue our studies, but he will give us permission to communicate with each other.
And you lived in the same house?
We lived in the same house and shared the same bedroom, so it would have been quite impossible not to communicate. So I carried on being actively involved in the struggle even when we were under banning orders. We did whatever work was asked of us to do until we were asked by the, well, we were both arrested for breaking our banning order. And at that time I then also consulted with Bram Fisher about what should happen. And then we were asked by the ANC to leave South Africa to go for further training abroad, which we did. We left on an exit permit in December 1964.
When you need an exit permit, is that a one-way exit out the country?
It's a one-way exit, which means you've undertaken not to return on pain of getting arrested. So we took an exit permit because it was also much easier to take an exit permit because the pressures on the movement was too great at that time for the underground structures to take people out of this country. And so it was easier for those who could get an exit permit to take an exit permit and leave. And that's what we did too. In exile, we both became very actively involved in the work of the ANC. I continued my studies. I did my MA at the University of Sussex. I then stayed on and did a doctorate in history at the University of Sussex. But we were very actively involved in the organization. I was recruited into the South African Communist Party in 1966. And since then have served in the leading structures of the South African Communist Party, both the Central Committee as well as the Politburo. I served in various structures of the African National Congress, including being a member of the National Executive Committee from 1994 to 2007. In the meantime, I also represented the South African Communist Party on the editorial council of the World Marxist Review from 1975 to 1985. In the meantime, after I returned to London in 1985, I was asked to serve on the ANC's Regional Political and Military Council based in London. So we continued our political work until we came back from exile I came back in July 1990.
Just before you talk about your return to South Africa, just for the record, you joined the SACP in 1966, according to your statement.
I was recruited. In those days, you didn't join the SACP, you were recruited.
And on what basis were you recruited?
Well, on the basis that the SACP had a position that, from their point of view, those who were leading the party at that time, that they would recruit into the party what they considered to be, or who they considered to be, some of the best cadres in the movement. And so I guess they thought I was good enough to be recruited to be a member of the SACP.
And was the SACP in London working openly or underground?
No, totally underground. So, for example, the unit I belonged to in London, only those of us who were part of that unit knew who was in the unit, except, of course, the people in the leadership. But the rest of us, and we were not at liberty to disclose our party membership to anybody outside of the unit that we belonged to.
And you mentioned that you reached the highest level of the decision-making body of the SACP, the Central Committee, and that was when?
In the 80s sometime. I was elected onto the Central Committee, and after 1990, I was elected onto the Politburo of the South African Communist Party.
Before I interrupted you, you mentioned that you had just returned to South Africa, I think in 1990.
In July 1990, there were three of us who were given a specific task. That's Jeremy Cronin, as well as, what's her name? Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, and I were given the task of resuscitating or rebuilding or building a legal party. If you'll recall that the SACP was also unbanned in February 2nd, 1990, and the three of us were given the task of being in the forefront of creating the structures of a legal SACP, which is what we did do, and which is what I did do. One of my early responsibilities was to be in charge of the party finances, and at the same time to be head of the international department of the Southern Communist Party as part of my responsibilities in the Central Committee and Politburo. I served on both those structures. In 1994, when the first democratic elections took place, I was put on the ANC list to go to the National Assembly. Prior to that, in the Northwest Province, at that time it was called the Western Transvaal, but Northwest Province, I was nominated to be the Premier-elect. But I turned it down. I turned it down because I thought that it was not going to be in the interest of the ANC if they had somebody who was a well-known communist in a situation in which the Bantustans in the old northern Bophuthatswana and them had some effect where in the rural areas you might still have anti-communist feelings. Secondly, I did not speak Tswana as a language, and in my view, if you wanted to be a premier in a province, you had to speak the language of the people.
Mr. Pahad, you ultimately did serve in Parliament and you became a cabinet minister.
I then became an MP, and after I became an MP, I first served as the parliamentary councillor to Deputy President Thabo Mbeki. That's just after the elections, a few months after the elections. In 1996, President Mandela appointed me Deputy Minister in the Deputy President's office, that's in Thabo Mbeki's office. After the elections in 1999, Mbeki appointed me as Minister in the Presidency, responsible for a whole number of functions. And after the elections in 2004, he once more appointed me as the Minister in the Presidency, which is where I served until I resigned, both as a Minister as well as an MP in 2008, when the National Executive Committee of the ANC asked Mbeki to step down as President of the country.
And you've also served on boards of non-governmental organizations.
Well, what I did serve on was a number of them, but I think the two main ones would have been the Timbuktu Trust Fund that we set up, which essentially is after Mbeki had been to Timbuktu and realized that a lot of the most priceless, actually priceless documents relating to the history of our continent, but especially in relation to Timbuktu and the development of Islam in that whole region, that he undertook to build a structure that could house the documents better. I was then head of the Timbuktu Trust. I also chaired the South African Democratic Education Trust, which has been responsible for the production of, in my time, at least 5 volumes of the more detailed history of our struggle in South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Pahad. Can we now turn to your relationship with Ahmed Timol, and can you describe how it was that you came to know Ahmed Timol?
Well, we knew each other because partly our grandparents came from the same village in India, and so you tended to know each other because for many of the people who came from the same village, they might have even been related through marriage. But our grandparents knew each other. Our parents were friends of each other. And so we knew each other from an early age. But our friendship really grew after, at the time when Timol came to study, to be a teacher in Fortsburg, because then we saw a great deal more of each other. And we spent a lot of time together. And of course, almost every weekend, Timol would come to Johannesburg from Roodepoort, and we would spend a lot of time together at weekends. But that's where our friendship really grew.
And I understand from your statement that you were so close that when you were banned, Timol helped you out?
He did, in spite of him having to give money to his parents, he would help me out in terms of when I had lack of funds, whether it was to slip into a cinema or buy something to eat or something in the cafes while you're sitting outside. And when I left for London, he bought me my first overcoat. I'd never worn an overcoat before in my life. He bought me my first overcoat, and so for many years the overcoat I wore in London was the one that he bought for me.
Please tell the court your association with Timol when Timol arrived in London.
Well, Timol arrived one day, knocked on our flat door, and when I went to open it, I found him standing there and said, "What do you want here?" So he said, no, I've come to London. I was in Mecca. I met with Dr. Dadu and Molvi Kachalia, and I've decided to come to London. So our flat in London, in North End House in West Kensington, was, if you like, an open door flat. There might be 20, 30, 40 people staying there at the same time. So we said, come, welcome. There's a bed, occupy the bed, but you have to work, which means you must learn how to wash dishes, you must learn how to clean toilets, you must learn how to clean the bathroom, because there's nobody going to do that for you here in England. But he found a teaching job, and so he was able to make a contribution towards buying food and all that in the house. And so that's how we became even closer and had a great deal more time to engage in political discussions, because Timol was greatly interested not only in South African politics, in our own struggle politics, but he was also greatly interested in what was happening in the world. What were the international struggles all about? At that time, the CND was a very powerful factor in British politics. That's a campaign for nuclear disarmament. And so we had a lot of discussions about international politics. And so our relationship not only became much more closer, but took on a much greater political content because of the continuous discussions that we had.
And can you describe the kinds of political activities Timol engaged in while he was in London and abroad?
No, we asked him not to, although sometimes he slipped away and joined the CND demonstration, because we said to him that he shouldn't come to these political activities, because the South African Security Police were obviously keeping an eye on people, and that if he was going to go back home, then it would make it much more dangerous for him to go back home. And so he did not participate in openly anti-apartheid activities taken by the anti-apartheid movement.
What do you know of his recruitment into the SACP?
Sorry?
What do you know of his recruitment, his joining of the SACP?
I would suspect that he was recruited by Dr. Yusuf Dadu, who was obviously one of the leaders of the South African Communist Party. He was then asked by the leadership of the SACP to go and study at the Institute of Social Sciences School in Moscow, which is also called the Lenin Party School. And he was there together with Thabo Mbeki and Ann Nicholson. I knew that he was going there because he was given permission to talk to me about going to the Soviet Union, going to the party school. So I was aware where he had gone to. Nobody else was aware of that. And so he went to the party school for nearly a year. When he came back, we had a lot of discussions about what he did at the party school. And then he was asked to go back home to work in the underground structures, both of the SACP as well as the ANC.
Who asked or instructed him to return to South Africa?
I would assume that it would be Yusuf Dadu, and he also received training by Jack Hodgson because in London, Jack Hodgson was principally responsible for training people in how to prepare petrol bombs and so on and so forth, because at that time, one of the methods that we used to distribute our illegal material was by the use of petrol bombs and other underground work. So he did receive training. I know that from Jack Hodgson.
When you mean a petrol bomb, do you mean a bucket bomb?
A bucket bomb, yes.
Yes. According to your statement, you were in fact the last person to talk to Ahmed Timol before he left for the airport. And that during that discussion, you spoke about the dangers, particularly dangers that might arise following an arrest.
I think what is very important to understand, and that's what we did discuss about, and I say this in my affidavit, that the possibilities of him getting arrested were very real. Partly given the fact that we had been heavily infiltrated by the old security police, partly that what he was doing was dangerous work and he could be identified as such. And in the course of that discussion, what we were also then discussing is how would one respond, because we already had enough information about the forms of torture that was used by the security branch officials to obtain information from detainees. So we had that information. We also knew a lot of people themselves who had been tortured by the apartheid regime. And we had a lot of discussions about that. And in the course of those discussions, I think I said to him a number of things. One, I said, look, when the ANC was banned in 1960, and we were asked to do certain things like putting up illegal ANC posters, distributing illegal ANC leaflets, and that, all you needed to do was to, if you were arrested, give them your name and address. I think we were a bit idealistic, not realizing what torture can do to people. But for me, and that's what we discussed with Ahmed, that it is not treacherous to break under torture. There are some individuals who manage to withstand the worst form of torture. Two of them would have been Abdullah Jassat and Lalu Chiba, who withstood the worst form of torture without breaking down, without giving any information. But it's not treacherous to break down under torture. As I say in my affidavit too, there is a limit to human endurance, and we understood there's a limit to human endurance. The important thing for us in the movement was that if you do break down and you do give information, what you should try to do is limit the information that you give. So that if you know that you worked with a number of people, you limit the number of names you would give of people that you worked with in the underground. Secondly, that you would try to, as much as it's possible, give this information gradually, so that those who had been working with you in the underground or that you had been recruiting would realize that you are under arrest, and therefore they would have to then take the necessary measures to protect themselves, which means either they would leave the country, depending on what they were doing, or go into hiding. And that's what we discussed in terms of what are the possible things that could happen to him if he was arrested while he was doing the underground work on the movement.
It's not in your statement, but did you perchance discuss with Mr. Timol approximately how long he should try to hold out for?
Sorry?
Did you discuss with Mr. Timol the duration of time that he should try to hold out for if he was arrested and interrogated? A day, 2 days,
not
longer?
Not duration of time, but so much that you try to hold on to as long as it is possible. Because it's impossible to determine, in my view, how any one particular individual would respond to the kind of pressures and tortures that was imposed on you. So the idea was just hold on for as long as you can. And as I said earlier, if you have to give names, give them on a gradual basis.
And did you discuss the possibility that the police might generate incriminating evidence against Mr. Timol and what he should do in that situation?
Oh yes, because it was obvious that all of the other trials that took place, that quite a lot of the so-called evidence that was being brought forward, incriminating type evidence, was engineered evidence. So we discussed that it's possible that if he gets arrested, they will find ways and means to incriminate him for a number of things. But it is impossible to say what exactly that would be, because you didn't know what information the security police would have about you and what is it that they were then looking for.
And the question of giving evidence against others, was that discussed?
And that's been the position in the movement, and that's a position that we took. For example, one of my tasks when I returned to England in 1985 was when people came to England and they were going to come back into the underground in the movement, I had to take them for political education. And I took them for political education. And that's one of the things that we did discuss about the delaying of giving the information, but trying to limit the amount of information you would give that would incriminate somebody else. Not about yourself, because you can tell them all about yourself, because you're incriminating yourself. In any case, once they'd arrested you and it was clear they had the information. And that's what we did discuss, always with all our people that we were involved in terms of the kind of political education training we would give them before they came back.
According to your statement, what was discussed was the possibility of breaking under torture and then potentially even agreeing to testify, but then recanting at court and saying, well, in fact, I was tortured and I refused to testify. Was that a tactic that was discussed with Mr. Timol?
It was very much, and we also had our own experiences here in South Africa. For example, a very close friend of mine was now dead, Billy Nennan. Billy had been arrested, had been tortured. He agreed to give evidence, and when he came to court, he refused to give evidence. And that was one of the things you did in order to reduce the volume of torture that was imposed on you. You would agree to give evidence. But the idea was once you go to court, you then refuse to give evidence. They can either then charge you with the other accused or take you back. But by that time, at least that information would have been public that you have been tortured, because you can say to court that it was under torture that you agreed to give evidence, but you are not going to give evidence against any of your comrades. And that was discussed, and that was a position that we tried to instill in those of our people who are coming into to work here in South Africa, that you can do that, so that it's possible that you break down, and that's not treacherous, but don't give evidence against another comrade. Be ready to go and be charged and be ready to be imprisoned, which in my view, Timol was ready to be imprisoned.
So he was aware of the risk of a potential long prison term, and you say he was ready for that. Was that discussed?
Oh, he was certainly aware of it, and he was certainly ready to undertake any term of imprisonment that would have been imposed on him.
So in your view, this was not a man who was scared of facing a prison sentence, even a long-term one?
No, not at all, because if he was, he would not have agreed to come and work in the underground.
Can we turn to the attitude or the policy, if there was one, of the SACP in relation to its cadres taking actions such as suicide for purposes of protecting the party.
Your Lordship, can I refer to the document? It's
Your Lordship, the document he's referring to is in Kululeko Freedom, dated February 1972, number 2. It's in volume C at page 15. Please proceed.
in my view, the concluding paragraphs under the subheading stand firm.
And that's on the last page, is it?
That's
Page
on the
7.
last page. No, it would be the last, yeah, that would be the last page. It's an absolute fabrication by the South African Security Police. It has nothing to do with the rest of the Nkululeko document. And I think if you read it carefully, you'll be able to tell that it actually is a translation from the Afrikaans. For example, they use the word here, if I may quote from it, Your Lordship, make sure your complaints and actions against the suppressors get the utmost publicity. There's no such word. And none of us would ever use the word suppressors. You would always use the word oppressors. I would guess that it's some translation from the Afrikaans. So that certainly would be one. And secondly, that in the very last paragraph, a number of people's names are mentioned, a concoction of names, Rolly Arnstein, Warren Berenger, Easy Maisels, MD Naidu, George Bezos, Sogot and others who have been fighting with us since the days at Livonia. In my view, the SACP would never have mentioned those names in this document or never have said that these are people working with us, because what would that mean, working with us? Because Easy Maisels was a lawyer, George was a lawyer. They were defending our people in the political trials. And I think this was a fabrication in order to try to implicate some of these lawyers and that in things that they were not doing or were not responsible for. So my very firm view is that those paragraphs under the subheading stand firm is an absolute fabrication by the special branch attached to the thing to try to indicate that the position of the SACP was that you should commit suicide if necessary. And my view is very clear. I am not aware, and have been a member of the party for a long time, having been involved in political education work with cadres that were coming back into this country, having also gone to Angola for military training in the Kashito camp, that it has never been part of policy of the party or the ANC or any protocol, and you will never find it in any documents of the party or the ANC where anybody would have been asked to commit suicide. It just is not possible. No, the party would never have said it, the ANC would have never said it.
If we can return for a moment to your last discussion with Mr. Timol, in your affidavit you make a reference, you say in our last discussions we had agreed that Ahmed should not commit suicide. In what context was that raised?
The context was that we were also discussing how the security police and the state agencies and how the courts themselves in South Africa were responding to the deaths of detainees. And you will recall that absurd statements were made such as somebody slipped on a bar of soap, somebody fell down a flight of stairs, that they will make up these stories. And in the context of that discussion about how the state structures would respond to the death of a detainee, we then discussed this matter that Timol would never commit suicide.
And why do you say that, knowing Mr. Timol, that he would never commit suicide?
Well, I think additionally, there are two additional reasons I give in the affidavit. One, Timol himself was a Muslim, brought up as a Muslim, and his parents were very pious, religious people. And a Muslim, in terms of Islamic edicts, should not and cannot commit suicide. And if you do, you will not be able to be buried in a Muslim gravesite. So just from that point of view, it seemed to me that as a Muslim, Timol would have been not in a position in which he would have wanted to commit suicide. The other reason was also that whilst he was in exile, he met Ruth Longoni. They fell madly in love. They really wanted to spend time together. At one time, they even thought of getting married until Timol agreed to leave her behind and come and work in the underground. Now, remember that Ruth could not join him here because of the Immorality Act. As a person of Indian origin, he would have been arrested if he was seen living in cohabitation, never mind sleeping, with a white woman. So she had to stay behind in England. And for me, always, Ahmed was going to come back to Ruth. And Ruth always thought that at some point Timol would come back to her. And therefore, the idea that Timol would commit suicide, for me, just doesn't seem plausible at all.
Thank you, Mr. Pahad. My Lord, no further questions.
Thank you, Your Lordship. Just getting back to Nkululeko number 2, the last paragraph, it said they issued by the Communist Party of South Africa. Have you got any comment on that, issued by the Communist Party of South Africa?
No, I'm aware that the party was issuing Nkululeko. I'm not aware of this particular issue because I didn't work on it. But having been given sight of it, I'm absolutely clear that those last few paragraphs are a fabrication.
Did you work on other publications, Mr. Pahad?
I did. I was on the editorial board of the African Communist as well as another journal of the party, Umsebenzi.
Thank you, my Lord.
Mr. Kutsu?
I have no questions.
Okay, thank you. The discussion you had with he left, could it be possible that in addition to that, he might have had discussions with Dr. Dadu or with Jack Hodgson about how to conduct himself in case he's arrested?
Well, I'm sure that you would have certainly have had discussions with Dr. Dadu because Dr. Dadu was one of the leaders of the party, and Dr. Dadu recruited him to go and come and work in the underground of the SACP. What those discussions were, I have no idea. He never told me what they discussed, and we never discussed what was discussed between him and Dadu. He might have had similar discussions with my brother Aziz. We were living in the same flat, and again, I'm not aware of any discussions that he had with him, nor did he ever tell me what discussions he might have had with Aziz Pahad before he left London for South Africa.
Could it be possible that they might have discussed the question of suicide?
Sorry?
Could it be possible that they might have discussed the question of suicide, of him committing suicide?
Your Lordship, I cannot comment on because I don't know what they would have discussed, but I would have no doubt in my mind that Yusuf Dadu would never have ever discussed. I mean, knowing Yusuf Dadu as I did, and having worked under him for so many years, that he would have ever discussed the matter of suicide. That was not part of the policy. It would be most strange if Dadu, as a leader of the Communist Party, South African Communist Party, would discuss that matter, because it was never part of the party's policy.
And last question from me. To your knowledge, do you know if before 1971, if there was any member of the South African Communist Party who is said to have committed suicide in South Africa, in prison or in detention?
I'm not aware of anybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you for your evidence.
No, thank you. And thank you for speaking a bit loud.
Yes, I was warned. Yes, Mr. Bond.
And all that concludes the evidence for today.
Yes.
Lord, tomorrow we have two important witnesses, two forensic pathologists, that's Professor Holland and Dr. Naidu.
Yes.
And we'll kick off with Professor Holland in the morning, and we'll call Dr. Naidu after she has finished.
Yes.
We do expect to probably use up much of tomorrow with those two witnesses.
And Thursday was the position. I just removed one witness from there.
I beg your
For Thursday?
So on Thursday, there is a slight change. The prosecution will commence with Mr. Don Foster in the morning. And once he is done, we're then going to have Mr. Frank Dutton, the private investigator for the family.
Yes. And that will be it?
And that'll be it, yeah.
Yes. I want to hear the evidence of Mr. Kachi at the end.
At the end. We'll make sure he comes at the end.
Yes, I'm giving him the honor to be heard at the end. We are here because of him.
That's right.
So there are interesting points he raises there, which I'd like to discuss with him when he's on the witness box. That's why I want to hear it at the end.
As the court pleases.
Okay. Yes. We'll then adjourn until tomorrow, 10 o'clock.
My Lord,
Yes.
my Lord,
just a minute, Mr. Thompson.
my Lord, before we adjourn, there is just one issue in respect of Mr. Rodriguez that I wish to argue or address his lordship on. I have not had yet an opportunity to give my learned colleagues a copy of the point which I want to raise. It's only in respect of the missing portion of the record concerning the evidence given in the 1972 inquest proceedings that Mr. Rodriguez has testified to. I have not yet had an opportunity to prepare arguing orally in court, and I have only given my colleagues these documents now. If His Lordship is inclined to also hear this point tomorrow, I would beg leave to end up a document which I have prepared, Lord, just for that point.
Oh, you want us to hear a motion? Is a motion that you want to bring in tomorrow?
It's not a motion, my Lord.
Yes.
It's just the participation of Mr. Rodriguez at this stage of the proceedings, my Lord. With the circumstances that we have concerning the record of the inquest proceedings of 1972.
Yes, that record, for reasons I do not understand, the record does not have the evidence of all the policemen who were interrogating and some of the investigators. That's the missing part of the record.
Yes, my Lord.
Strangely. And I have the rest of the other witnesses who testified, as well as the judgment by the magistrate.
I have seen that, my Lord.
Yes, and the magistrate does sum up some of what transpired during the proceedings. That's as close as we can get to the proceedings.
Yes, my Lord.
How much evidential value we'll place on that is something that you will argue at the end.
Yes, my Lord.
Yes, but you say you want us to deal with this thing tomorrow.
If it pleases the court, my Lord, because I have not yet had an opportunity to prepare myself. I have only drafted a concise set of submissions on that point, which I wish to address tomorrow, my Lord.
Okay.
And
fine.
Also to give my colleagues an opportunity to consider that point as well and make submissions on that point.
Yes, okay.
As it pleases the court.
Okay, fine. We will then start with Dr. Pituras, how long is the evidence of Mr. Foster? Is it going to be?
Professor Doncaster evidence won't be that long, my lord. 2 hours at the most. Already the book, Detention in Torture in South Africa, I have given copies to some of the people, so it's basically it was a summary of his book. So Thursday it's a good idea that we can do the argument, seeing that tomorrow we will have the evidence of the medical personnel tomorrow, the doctors tomorrow, that Thursday possibly, if we want to prepare something. But his evidence won't be long, 2 hours.
You'd rather we hear this argument on Thursday?
I think so, seeing that it's quite complicated, the evidence that's going to be led tomorrow, my lord. And to give us time to do a little bit of preparation, my lord.
Yes, Mr. Vanu, what's your view on this?
Yes, my lord, I would agree with the submission of Mr. Pretorius.
Yes. Advocate Monsieur?
I'm also in agreement with that for Thursday.
We put it for Thursday?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Thompson, will you be ready?
That would suit me, my lord.
Okay, fine. Okay, then we'll hear this on Thursday. We are adjourned until tomorrow 10 o'clock, whereupon we will proceed with the witnesses.
Are you looking to stop Rodriguez from testifying until there's a full record?